We've been looking at the section of the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew 5, verses 21 to 48, which are often called antitheses. I've been calling them triads. There's a triadic structure, as the scholar Glenn Stassen has said. Jesus cites the Torah, then he describes the kind of vicious cycles and dynamics that lead to violation of the Torah, and then only in the third stage does he actually give a command. And that command is a way of acting and obeying Jesus and following Jesus that participates in the redemptive righteousness of Jesus' own work, participates in the righteousness of the kingdom. Jesus moves from murder. He cites the sixth commandment, thou shalt not murder, and then he moves on to the seventh commandment. Jesus said, you've heard it said, thou shalt not commit adultery, but I say to you, any man who looks at a woman to lust after her has committed adultery in his heart. Now, there's a lot of confusion about what that means. Some people think that that's somehow a condemnation or raises suspicion about sexual desire as such. And there's some reason to think that, because the word lust in the Greek is simply the word for desire. But that can't possibly be true. I mean, it would be impossible to obey because sexual desire is kind of built into us. We shouldn't obey it because sexual desire is a good thing. God made us sexual beings with sexual desires, and he approves of those sexual desires. And besides, as Benedict says in Much Ado About Nothing, the world must be peopled, and if we got rid of sexual desire, the world would not be peopled. That's not what Jesus is talking about. I think we should understand what Jesus says as it's a purpose clause. Any man who looks at a woman in order to lust after her, to cultivate lust. And any guy knows what we're talking about. A guy knows what it means to look at a woman and approve of her and recognize her beauty, recognize her desirability. That's one thing. But on the other hand, there's a kind of checking her out look. I mean, pornography is kind of an ideal type of this kind of gaze that Jesus is condemning. Because you look at pornography in order to arouse evil desire, in order to arouse a desire to break God's commandments. That's the kind of gaze that Jesus is condemning. But how does Jesus want us to deal with that? Jesus doesn't say, you've heard it said, thou shalt not commit adultery, but I say to you, don't have any desires. Rather, Jesus says that we should perform a kind of radical surgery in order to remove the source of those desires. It's important to see that Jesus doesn't blame the woman at whom the man is looking. He doesn't say, I say to you, any man who looks at a woman in order to lust after her should get more modest covering for the woman. He blames the man and says the man has to perform the radical surgery. The one who's lusting, who has these evil desires, has to perform the radical surgery and remove whatever source is the cause of his evil desire. Jesus puts it in stark terms. We're to offer ourselves almost as sacrifices, pluck at our eye, cut off our hand if our eye or hand offend us, so that we will enter into life rather than with a whole body to be thrown into hell. Jesus says we have to perform radical surgery. If it means getting rid of the internet, get rid of the internet. If it means breaking off certain relationships that are leading you to evil desires, break off those relationships. Again, we're seeing that Jesus is giving commandments that he expects us to obey. This is not an impossible standard. He expects us to obey these commandments, and that by obeying these commandments, we're not just avoiding adultery, but we're actually resolving and establishing a kind of sexual justice, purity in sexual relations. By performing this radical surgery, we can relate to one another as opposite sexes in a way that brings honor to God, and there can be harmony between the sexes, a harmony that is the harmony of God's kingdom.